It was the fall of 1944. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came to Moscow. It was extremely cold because the Moscow winter had arrived early. When his car was passing through the city center, through the car window, Churchill saw a man standing on a street corner eating an ice cream. The Prime Minister turned to the Russian diplomat accompanying him and asked whether the man was indeed eating an ice cream in the freezing cold. And the diplomat, he just shrugged his shoulders as if to say, "What's the big deal?" And then Churchill was reported to say, "The people who eat ice cream in such cold weather are invincible." Russia, then and now. Hi, I'm Mark from An American in Russia. Okay, the year was 2001, and I just recently arrived in Russia. I was living in the city of Chelyabinsk near the Ural Mountains. Maybe not the coldest place in Russia, but still colder than a lot of other places. It's about minus 25 degrees Celsius that day outdoors. That's about minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And I would see ice cream stands open on the street with people buying ice cream and eating it as they walked. I mean, this would be a common sight in any city during the summer, but December? Well, let me explain the huge contradiction about this. And now my Russian friends will get pissed off at me and not see the humor with the following, but what the heck, I'm just presenting my views at the time. Russians, as a rule back then, thought that drinking or eating anything cold will make you sick. I'm not sure what kind of sickness because I never got any kind of sickness from eating or drinking anything cold. But seriously, this is Russia, and it's the land of cold. But just try to find ice cubes somewhere. You can't, not back then. A cold drink will often be taken out of the fridge and made to warm up to room temperature before being drunk. I mean it. You can't make this stuff up. A Russian will think that you are a suicidal nut for drinking something cold. It's almost as if it'll kill you or something. This seemed nutty as hell to me. And I seemed nutty as hell to them when I had a cold drink. And this will never change. So rather than argue about this every time I'm thirsty, I just drink my cold drink and not listen to their warnings of medical doom. So imagine the strangeness to me of seeing somebody walking down the street when it is super cold and they're eating ice cream. To me, Russia was a bizarro place at times. In this cold weather back then, anyhow, babushki, or grandmothers, they never stay home on cold days. Seriously. You see these old babushki hauling all kinds of bags through the streets and on transport. I saw these old grandmothers out shopping at outdoor markets when it was nearly minus 40 degrees. And 40 degrees Celsius is the same as 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the one temperature where they're both the same. Now, I'm sure that many of you who are listening to this episode have never experienced minus 40 degrees. Well, I have several times. And the thing which is rather cool is that you could easily die in this weather at those temperatures. So it's a survival thing. Kind of cool, I guess, if you're not dying. I will mention one and perhaps the only advantage of having the frozen babushki out and around during such weather is that they won't sit down on the cold seats of public transport. They feel that this can kill them, get them sick somehow. So I'm able to come along and get a seat for once on transport. Well, here in many Russian cities, you'll see something each winter that if it was in the States, people would drive hundreds of miles and take thousands of pictures. I'm speaking about the Ice Village located in the main square of almost any Russian city. This village is complete with beautiful castles and buildings, animals, and even Father Frost, all sculpted from solid ice. Now, I remember some ice sculptures back in the United States they have in certain cities, but nothing like I would see here. Usually in late November, large blocks of ice are cut from some of the local lakes. When I say large, I mean up to about 3 meters by 1.5 meters. That's about 10 feet by 5 feet. and usually about 25 centimeters thick. That's about 10 inches thick. The 25 centimeters is the thickness of the ice on the lakes in late November in the Chelyabinsk region. Anyhow, these are trucked to the main square by the hundreds, and workers begin by attaching together as many as needed, using additional water until the correct height, length, and thickness is reached. After they are solidly frozen, in come the ice sculptors. These craftsmen, artists, or whatever you want to call them, are really talented, no less talented than those who work in stone, except that sculpting in ice is faster than stone. A large variety of sculpting tools are used, although at the very beginning, sometimes the good old-fashioned chainsaw will be used to get the object into the approximate shape in the quickest manner. After that, it's a longer process which has amazing results. When the sunlight shines through these sculptures, it seems as if they are made from a single huge diamond. Such is the skill and resultant beauty. Well, from late November until perhaps March, hundreds or thousands of people will make the trip to Revolution Square to see the village. It's not only a place to view sculptures, but also a place where you can actually go inside of some of them, while others have been formed into huge ice slides for the children. I mean, with little doors you go in a village and a huge slide. It's unbelievable. In addition to the sculptures, there are even a couple of carnival-type rides, though not made from ice, of course. One of these is typically a flying swing, with people all sitting in swing-type seats, then flying almost parallel to the ground as centrifugal force has its way with you. Now, think about this for a minute. In the US, we have something called the wind chill factor, which adjusts the winter temperature downward depending on how much wind is present. In Russia, it's called something like comfort factor. But its purpose is the same, to show that the stronger the wind on a cold day, the colder the temperature will feel. Now think about really cold temperatures amongst an ice village. Now factor in the wind chill as you're speeding through the air on a flying swing. And I'm also sure that some of these people have an ice cream that they're eating. These are some tough cold weather people. Just ask Napoleon's army, or for that matter, the Nazi army. While other nationalities are left on the ground as frozen corpses, these people are flying through frozen air eating ice cream. I know who I want as my winter buddies. Russians certainly believe in the practice of layers of clothes in the winter, especially mothers dressing their children for the outdoors. I mean, an onion has fewer layers than a Russian child. A young child will have so many layers on them that they are round as a ball. Seriously, if they're riding on the flying swing and the chains break that held the seat, the child would fly through the air, and chances are that they would not get hurt at all, just bounce a lot. Now, in the winter in Chelyabinsk, there were no school buses in the city, so a child walked, was driven, or took public transport to school. Schools do close when the temperature is too low, and it depends upon the age of the child, but usually they start closing around minus 25, minus 30 Celsius. In Russia also, many housing complexes, apartment buildings, had an outdoor skating rink set up in the yard for the kids for the winter time. Now we did, and it was really nice to have. Our kids learned how to skate when they were quite young and skated outdoors quite often. Services there, they could be pretty dismal overall at that time, back in 2001. But I do have to say that they took good care of the skating rink, plowing it after it snowed and flooding the ice when the surface started to get too scarred up. So we had 2 enclosed balconies on our apartment. Each overlooked the opposite sides of our apartment complex. So from one, you could look down at the skating rink, and from the other, you overlooked a nice little park where there were snow slides set up each winter. It was really beautiful sight out the balconies in the winter. Now, the city where we lived at the time was Chelyabinsk, was not full of hills as some cities are. So this was compensated for by constructing hills for sleds during the winter. Most yards had a giant pile of snow that's pushed into a mountain basically by bucket loaders. These piles were then made into a big slide which was made of snow and ice, complete with stairs made from ice to get to the top of the slide. And they would hose it somewhat, let it freeze, and there you go. Kids would spend hours flying down the man-made hills, having a blast. The park next to us had a rather large one, constructed of wood and steel, actually. Actually, a couple of these of varying sizes. These were assembled each winter and sprayed with water in order to form a nice icy surface for sliding. The landing area was also ice for a distance of about, 25 meters, 80 feet. And the kids used up every bit of this as they flew down the ice hill on their sleds or cardboard or even just on their bellies. It looked like a great time, and I wish I had these when I was growing up. But where I grew up in the state of Connecticut in the USA, the slide would need to be refrigerated because although winter can get cold, even in January, it still is often above the freezing mark, so no frozen slides or ice villages there. Well, so far this has been an overall positive episode in terms of winter in Chelyabinsk. Here in schools and universities, as part of physical training, or PE, you'd see groups of students cross-country skiing during the winter, which is a great idea in terms of exercise, but it can also develop a lifelong habit of that type of thing in the winter. On more than one occasion, I've seen some pensioners getting on or off the bus with their cross-country skis in hand. I mean, older people, older than I am anyhow. There was a nice cross-country skiing center with the entrance located right on a well-served public transport route, not far from my house. It was really great. Now, I mentioned the skating rinks in different apartment complexes, and there are a number of larger rinks located at the various parks here, but those you did have to pay to skate at those rinks. It wasn't much, plus you could rent skates. Additionally, while I was still there in Chelyabinsk, they built a new indoor rink. It was called Ural Molnia, or Ural's Lightning. And this rink was huge. It was so big that a standard hockey rink is set up in the center, yet the area left for public skating all the time greatly exceeds that of the hockey rink. Now, this was a very popular destination for young people throughout the year. It can also be noted that the World Curling Championship was held there a few years before I moved. Not bad for the city. But like the rest of the world, which really had no idea what curling was, there is now a deepening interest in the sport there in Chelyabinsk. Well, I've spent a lot of time talking about the then part of my Then and Now episode. I have to admit that this is one of the few episodes that I'd have to say I preferred the past to the present here in Russia. From the time that my daughters were born, they spent a lot of time outdoors during the winter. They were born in Russia. They were born in Chelyabinsk. They were taken on walks, and this, mind you, was every day, and for at least an hour every day. Often they would fall asleep, even though the temperature was minus 25. They walked to school every day, and many days would skate on the skating rink in front of our apartment building. It seems to me now that kids are maybe a little softer than they were previously. Most kids no longer walk to school. Their parents chauffeur them almost anywhere they need to go. The outdoor skating rinks are not quite the hub of activity that they used to be. Kids are happier, it seems, using the internet on their little phones or communicating with their friends online rather than face-to-face. I much preferred winters back around 2001, and I think they are much healthier and better for everyone. On the plus side now, it seems to me that the cities have taken better care of the streets in the winter. Gone forever are the babushki that used to clear all of the walkways in front of the apartment buildings, just using some old broom built out of bundled twigs. Seriously, this is how it was done. Now this is done the way it should be, using snow blowers and plows, and not babushki. The reason why I can't talk a lot about the winters nowadays is because my daughters grew up and moved away from home. So there's no longer such an urgency to get outdoors during the winter. Now I guess I'm up to my old Western tricks. Just hunker down and hibernate, counting the days till spring. Well, that's all I got for today. Until my next episode. Пока.